Hello. Welcome back to Mistress of the Damned, the channel where we believe free speech and pursuit of knowledge are everyone's rights. If you believe that too, then you too are damned. I am your Mistress Katrina. Welcome. Nice to see you. Nice to meet you. It is the last Monday of the month, which means it is time for another book on a president. And if you watched last month's book on James Madison, you know I was not impressed with it. I thought it lacked some of the biography that made Madison so interesting. So I read a different book on Madison for this month, James Madison, A Life Reconsidered by Lynne Cheney. Apologize for the chewed up cover. I left it under a fan one night and one of my cats thought, well, that looks like a fine chew toy. And he chewed it up because I'm an idiot and left a paperback book under a fan. But this book was what I was looking for in a biography on a president. James Madison was born on March 16th, 1751. He was the oldest of 12 children, of whom only 7 would survive to childhood. A nearly 50% mortality rate among the young was not uncommon in the 18th century. The family home was not initially at Montpelier. I mean, they owned the property at Montpelier. They owned thousands of acres in that area. But rather, the family home was Mount Pleasant, which was basically this tiny little 416 square foot house. Yeah, can you imagine cramming in? They had 12 children, 2 adults, it's 14 people. I mean, yes, okay, half of them died in the interim, but that's a tiny little square footage for a huge family. That was the ancestral home. Madison's grandparents and their 3 children lived there. When James Madison's father and mother started having kids, they decided to build a bigger house at Montpelier, and that's the house that Madison would eventually expand upon and turn into the grand house that it is today. Now, Madison's parents encouraged learning for all of their children, and when Madison reached the level of intelligence for college, he opted for College of New Jersey, which is, today it's Princeton, but back then it was called the College of New Jersey, which was, he preferred that over the more local College of William and Mary for health reasons. The Piedmont area of Virginia, which is the mountainous area that Madison grew up in, had a very different climate from kind of the lowland marsh area of Williamsburg, which is where the College of William and Mary was. And so he went to New Jersey because the climate was better for his health. And however, now that was still expensive, right? I mean, even if he had gone to William and Mary, his parents would have had to pay for housing and expenses and everything else. But Princeton was even further away. However much as parents encouraged learning, his parents were also very frugal, with 6 other kids at home that lived. Madison, who was well advanced in languages even before he got to Princeton. I mean, he was very articulate and learned multiple languages. He was able to save his family some money by essentially cramming together his studies for his junior and senior year. So he graduated in 3 years instead of 4, which is a mark of intelligence no matter what generation you're living in, right? This heavy work kind of caused some health issues, which are not easily diagnosed from 250 years later, but it's kind of hypothesized that he may have been epileptic. That certainly caused some depression for Madison. He was raised in a church where epilepsy was seen as sort of a sign of condemnation and spiritual weakness. And I think he went through kind of a down period during that, having been basically diagnosed with this disease that was seen as spiritual weakness. But, and this is kind of one of the things that becomes a defining characteristic of Madison's life, he shrugged off that conventional belief regarding epilepsy. And rather than consigning himself to the church's judgment, such as it was, he sought out medical advice and also looked for other historical figures who may have been afflicted to see how they handled it. And while his epilepsy was not cured, because, there's not even a cure for epilepsy today, it's treated with medicine, he was able to control it to a remarkable degree with diet and exercise. And he became an avid horseman and exercised frequently and did everything he could to control these fits. Learned to recognize the signs so that he would not have one in public and could kind of, resign himself or retire somewhere to ride it out, if you will. Now, his father was also a political creature. So when the Stamp Act and the Intolerable Acts and everything that led up to the Revolution were passed, there was no family divide. The entire family believed that Britain was overstepping and America needed to split and do their own thing. And when revolution was declared, Madison did attempt to join the local militia, and I say attempt because his epilepsy precluded his actual service. Apparently he was one hell of a shot. He could hit a target, but they couldn't risk him having an episode during battle. That's a no-go. Can't have that. So he was excused from service. Now, again, he could have fallen into depression and been like, oh, I have this health issue, oh no. He didn't. He promptly turned his mind to politics. That was his strength. That's what he was good at. He couldn't serve as a soldier. He'd serve as a voice. And that's what he did. And what a voice. Holy cow. I think generally Madison is seen as shy, historically speaking. But based on this book, I don't think he was shy. I think he was incredibly intelligent. So much so that he realized if you let people speak, they'll tell you exactly who they are. But you got to shut up long enough to hear what they're saying. So I don't think he was shy. I think he was probably one of the smartest people ever, certainly one of the smartest politicians ever. He was capable of shutting up and letting others show their true colors. That's so rare in a world where people just want their voice to be heard. And hey, I'm certainly guilty, right? I'm here talking. I'm reading this book report for you guys. I read the book. I'm reading the report. So I certainly want my voice to be heard. But it's rare to be able to just sit down, shut up, and let people tell you who they are. That's so uncommon. He served in politics his entire life, and he made very few missteps in who to trust in that very long career. And once he realized the misstep, he was pretty quick to cut ties with the people. So Alexander Hamilton being one example of somebody that he cut ties with. God, allergies and smoke in the air. Ugh. Madison was absolutely instrumental in getting the Constitution both written and passed. I don't think he wrote the whole of the Constitution, and very few of the arguments that were made on the floor regarding various passages were made by him, but he was like an enormous puppet master. He just pulled the strings of various political creatures to get the sections that were important to him passed without actually arguing himself. Again, I don't think this speaks to him being shy, because by all accounts he was certainly able and capable of campaigning and speaking to people and speaking publicly. I think he was just very good at getting other people to do the work for him, which, not a bad thing. It's not that he was lazy. He was fully capable of doing the work himself, and he was tireless and dedicated. It's just that he knew how to delegate to achieve the best effect, and he did very well with it, as evidenced by the eventual passing of the Constitution with the bits that were really important to him enshrined. So he got these arguments passed without actually arguing himself, and that's the impression you get from the book, and I do believe it. The reason I believe it is that the notes he took during the Constitutional Convention, Madison was not elected Secretary of the Convention. That honor went to William Jackson from South Carolina? I believe it was South Carolina. Anyways, William Jackson was the official Secretary of the Constitutional Convention. But Madison's notes were so detailed and well compiled that we actually have a really comprehensive journal of everything that went on at the convention. And have you ever tried to read and write at the same time? I mean, it's not impossible, but it's certainly not an easy thing to do, right? And given that he would have been having to dab in an inkwell and then write and then presumably stand up to make his argument, it just makes more sense that he passed on the arguments he wanted made to other people who were also orators and got them to make the arguments for him. After the convention, Madison was no less active. He worked with Alexander Hamilton before their split, and John Jay on the Federalist Papers, which was that series of essays written largely to persuade the northern states that joining was a good thing. 9 states were needed to ratify the Constitution in order for it to take effect, and it was by no means a sure thing. But the Federalist Papers were certainly instrumental in getting that passed, and he wrote somewhere between 25 and 30% of them, I think. I think I read in here somewhere that Alexander Hamilton wrote about 60%, John Jay wrote about 5%, so that would be about 35% of those papers were written by James Madison. One of the interesting aspects of Madison was the ability to absorb points made by other people and then change his mind based on new information and a convincing argument. Something so very few people are capable of doing today, probably myself included. I definitely have some things where I dig in my feet and decide I'm right, but I try. I at least try to change my mind based on new information. One such argument on which he changed his mind was the Bill of Rights, which initially he saw no need for. He thought it was ridiculous that we didn't need a Bill of Rights because the Constitution specifically said this is what the government can do, and it was assumed that everything else was delegated to the states. But while campaigning to get the Constitution passed, he came to see this as a necessity. And so once he was elected to Congress, he initially wanted to be a senator, but back when the Constitution was first passed, the Senate wasn't chosen directly by the people. It was chosen by the legislature of the individual states, which means that the state of Virginia legislature chose who their senators were, not the people as a body politic. But he didn't get that because the governor at the time was Patrick Henry, who basically detested James Madison. And so he made sure the legislature picked other people. So Madison instead campaigned and won a congressional district, which was no mean feat because Henry so hated him that he actually divided up the districts specifically to put Madison in a district where the people were anti-federalists at the time, meaning they were against the passing of the Constitution and the ratification and joining this nation. He still managed to win with 57% of the vote, which is pretty damn good. He became congressman, went to Congress, which at the time was in New York City. Remember, started in New York for a few years, went to Philadelphia before settling in D.C. Anyways, he started in New York, where he helped to write the first 10 amendments following the passage of the Constitution. One of the other interesting things in this book is that unlike the other founding fathers who did not want any political parties, Madison saw them as necessary for the running of the Union. Now, I don't think he necessarily thought there would only ever be two ever. I think he probably envisioned something more akin to modern Europe, where there are at least 13 political parties in operation. He believed that many parties with smaller representative interests would be better for the people as a whole, because then no one party would ever be able to gain a clear majority, thus ensuring restraint on the federal government. That was his belief at the time, and I really wish that would have happened here. From the absolute start of the country, we had political parties, okay? All of the other books I've read, the one on, Washington, Adams, Jefferson, and the first one on James Madison, they all said the same thing. Parties were here from the beginning, and Washington and Adams were identified as belonging to the Federalist Party. So that was our very first political party, with the Federalists and then the Anti-Federalists, although very shortly, because 12 short years, because we had Washington for 2 terms, Adams for a third. In that 12 short years, Jefferson and Madison, working together, created the Republican Party. Now, Republican Party in quotes here. Small tangent. If you Google Jefferson and Madison, if you go to their websites for Montpelier and Monticello and look for their biographical information, these sites, Wikipedia, Monticello, Google, they're all going to say that Jefferson and Madison formed the Democratic Republican Party. I think, because from my understanding, eventually the party they formed became the bedrock upon which the modern day Democratic Party was built. I think. And Lynne Cheney even specifically mentions that the Republican Party Madison helped found has nothing to do with the modern day Republican Party, of which Abraham Lincoln was first elected president. That's from Lynne Cheney, wife of former Vice President Dick Cheney, a Republican. So she thought that needed to be thrown in specifically, that disclaimer that the two parties have nothing alike. So I'm kind of interested to see how party politics destroyed the early Republican Party, because this early Republican Party sounds a lot like modern-day libertarianism. It's sad they ever went away, because we really need that. Tangent aside, Madison was elected to Congress right out of the gate. He was the very first Speaker of the House. Served 4 terms as congressman before retiring from politics to Montpelier with his new wife Dolly, stepson Payne, and sister-in-law Anna, who he and Dolly helped raise from the time she was 14 years old until she married. Retirement lasted until he was called to be Jefferson's Secretary of State, which position he served in for 8 years before being elected president in 1808, serving as president from 1809 until Monroe stepped in 1817. Now, most of those years were covered in last month's book on Madison, but a few more details here. The War of 1812, while the initial land actions were catastrophic due to older Revolutionary War era generals still serving, as they began to die off and retire, younger generals were promoted, and America began to win some of those land battles. There were 2 impediments to the war, which were not greatly discussed in last month's book. One of them was Secretary of War John Armstrong, who seemed to think he could use his position as Secretary of War to countermand and control the Army, making decisions that were not his to make, given that, per the Constitution, Madison is the Commander-in-Chief. He delegates the authority, but Armstrong was only supposed to act on the orders that Madison gave him, and he didn't. And it's not like there was a delay in communication because, we have the internet today and they didn't have that back then. Everything was done by messenger on horseback. Madison would be right there in the same camp, and Armstrong would just issue his own orders. That's that's a problem, right? Ultimately, this led to his resignation mid-war, right after the British had come in and destroyed Washington, D.C., Armstrong retired, and Secretary of State James Monroe was moved into the position of Secretary of War. And so he took over from there, and that was fine. The generals were all happy to work with Monroe. They thought he was very capable. The other impediment, and last month's book made it seem like the country was more or less united behind the War of 1812, and that's very clearly not the case. I don't think he ever said that. That was just my impression that I got, was that the country backed it. The other impediment were the northern states, the Federalist-controlled states. They didn't want the war. So you got New Hampshire, Maine, New York, New Jersey, Delaware, Maryland, Massachusetts. All of these had shipping and manufacturing interests that had already been heavily impacted by the embargo that had been enacted by Jefferson. They didn't support this war at all because their interests were being damaged severely. And there were members of Congress who were pushing to have the northern states categorized as seditious and in a state of rebellion. But Madison, because he was an ardent supporter and genuinely believed what was written in the Constitution, did not see them as seditious. He saw them as exercising the right to free speech, which speech will frequently criticize the government. And so he said, no, they're exercising their rights. They have the right to disagree with me, but we're still going to do this war because this is what's needed. We have our sailors are being impressed. We have to stop this. And so the war continued. We know the War of 1812 ended with a stunning victory at New Orleans. The numbers are actually given in this book, so I went through and found them again when writing this up. Jackson absolutely annihilated the British at the Battle of New Orleans, and it was a massive annihilation. The British lost 2,600 troops. The Americans lost 7, with an additional 6 wounded. So 13 to 2,600 was our ratio. So we kicked the ever-loving shit out of the British at the Battle of 1812, or Battle of New Orleans, excuse me. Now, I get that in the future Jackson is going to do some pretty fucked up shit. All right, I don't remember much about Andrew Jackson specifically, but I do remember he does some pretty awful things. But given this brilliant military victory, it's not at all hard to see how he wins a presidency in the future. That battle ended the War of 1812, but it was a Pyrrhic victory. The war was fought to end the impressment of U.S. sailors. The reason the British were impressing the U.S. sailors was to fight their own continuing battle with Napoleon, which ended definitively at Waterloo in 1815. So the British no longer had any need to impress sailors. So the treaty, the Treaty of Ghent, I think was what it was called, that ended the War of 1812, restored matters to the state they had been in before the war. No agreement not to impress sailors in the future, just a return to status quo with the belief that impressment was no longer necessary because the war with Napoleon had ended. So basically the war on the continent had been resolved to Britain's satisfaction. So it was kind of a shit treaty. But the war was not a total waste, because our incredibly tiny navy, and I mean it was tiny compared to Great Britain's military prowess or naval prowess, once we gave them leave to act, we let Britain know that the U.S. is not a nation to fuck with. I mean, even with the restoration to matters as they were, Britain, as far as I know, never attempted to impress U.S. sailors again, because we beat the tar out of them on sea. So, go Navy. You guys rock. Madison, once the war was over, and there was no law at this time preventing presidents from running for a third term, but Washington sort of set the tone. He ran 2 terms. Jefferson only ran 2 terms. So Madison went with that tradition and only ran 2 terms, stepping down when Monroe was elected in 1816 and inaugurated in 1817. So he did, in fact, retire at this point. No retirement, in name only. He actually retired from public life and kind of began this slow slide into poverty, brought on by paying off other people's debts, mostly those from his stepson, Payne Todd. Madison died on June 28, 1836 at Montpelier and was buried in the family plot without a headstone, which was by his design. Jefferson specifically designed the obelisk that sits over his own grave, while Madison was basically humble to the end. I mean, he believed his works were his legacy. The headstone's there now. I've seen it. I've been there. But it was paid for by contributions from admirers who didn't want his final resting place unmarked. And the men of that time were so incredible. They accomplished so much in their lives, but I think that Madison was a giant among men, not physically. He was only 5'4", which I believe makes him the shortest president we've ever had. But his ideas formed a nation. He consistently lived within the laws he constructed, never believing he was above those laws. And as far as I know, his biggest regret was having never solved the problem of slavery while he was in a position to do so. And this book, incidentally, is why I read, all right? As much as I still adore John Adams, I think that Madison may have replaced him as my favorite, or I don't know, replaced. Maybe they're tied now for first place in my mind. Adams had that catastrophe known as the Alien and Sedition Acts, which were an absolute abomination in a free country. But Madison actually owned slaves, which is a worse abomination in a free country. But without Madison, we would not have the Constitution and the freedom that we have today. And while almost from the word go, this document has been interpreted differently by people in political power, Madison always, consistently saw it as limiting the government. So whenever Congress passed legislation that expanded government control, Madison vetoed it, like a president should. Patriot Act. That's it for this week. If you want to know more about President Madison, I definitely recommend, there it is again, James Madison, A Life Reconsidered by Lynne Cheney. If you like what you saw, make sure you hit that subscribe button, like and share my videos, let me know what you think in the comments, and I will see you next week. Bye.